Hello my friends, my name is Jose Frugone and welcome to this first video of the series Consciousness as a Modular Phenomenon. A bit of introduction about myself. I am a physicist from Uruguay. My specialization is quantum chaos. My thesis was in quantum chaos in the year 2000. I finished my career here in Poland. And so this specialization took me to a path where I could study topics like complex, chaotic, hierarchical systems such as our brain. And that took me also to be interested in topics like consciousness, specifically when I read the Penrose book, Roger Penrose book, The Emperor's New Mind. This was kind of a shock for me to see the topic of consciousness treated in a rigorous and scientific way. The conclusion that he is led to is that quantum mechanics is not enough for describing the topic of consciousness. You need to add something else. And I will explain along all these videos the reason why, he describes very well why he suspects he gets this conclusion, and what he adds to quantum mechanics to try to go beyond, to make progress in the topic of consciousness is gravity. He's a specialist in gravity and he's a general relativist. So what he say is that probably, this is his hypothesis, what we are missing to do progress in the topic of consciousness is that you have to add gravity to quantum mechanics. So combining the two, you get this famous or dream of theory of quantum gravity, and this is what he suspects, that quantum gravity has something to do with consciousness at the end of the day. For me, the main message is that the language of quantum mechanics is not enough for attacking a problem like consciousness, and that we have to add something. And this is exactly what I would like to do, not exactly like Penrose, adding gravity, but I would like to change the language in which we speak about consciousness. I will also add some elements, but more from the mathematical point of view, not so much from the physical point of view. However, also there will have an implication, the mathematical structures that I will try to add to the game, to the quantum mechanical games about consciousness, will kind of have an effect in the physics that describes. The same thing as Penrose was trying to do, but he was more concrete about adding gravity to the picture. In my case, I'm going to add not to depart too much about quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics for me is a correct theory, it's a meta theory that speaks about the measurements, for example. So I'm not going to try to challenge that. I'm just going to add a change in the language, and you will see how this change on the language will be important to understand a lot of properties of consciousness itself. Something important. I would like this video to be popular, of course, but I'm not going to, let's say, to try to make it popular in the sense of not speaking about mathematical objects or physical theories. No. I want to be, if possible, rigorous, but not boring, of course, if possible. And but I would like to talk about in depth about the topics. So let's start with the title, Consciousness as a Modular Phenomenon. When I say modular, physicists and especially mathematicians will understand what I am talking about, modular mathematics specifically. And we are going to talk a lot about that. And so let's jump straight to the introduction of the topic, as I would like to start with a little bit of history of the topic of consciousness. So the topic of consciousness, of course, has occupied philosophers, scientists, and theologians for millennia already. Everybody has had something to say about the topic of consciousness because it's a fascinating topic. But it's a topic that is hard for natural sciences because uh, you cannot make too many experiments about consciousness. I mean, a psychologist can describe patterns of a conscious entity, ourselves. A sociologist can describe the patterns of a society of, I mean, made of people that has conscious, of course, consciousness, and but it's hard to make experiments about that because the experience of consciousness is something internal in reality. I mean, we feel it, but it is not easy to describe the properties of consciousness itself. But we can talk about the systems where consciousness arises, like, for example, the brain. An animal that is conscious in some way also has brains. Um, so the topic of consciousness has been historically, until the Middle Ages more or less, only the topic of philosophy and religion, mostly. But in the Middle Ages was born modern medicine, let's say, in a very primitive way, but it was recognized the role of our brain in consciousness, in our consciousness. So for the first time, we had a correlation between a physical system and consciousness. There was something else to connect to the physical world. So, of course, we had to wait until the birth of psychology in the 19th century to start seeing something else. I mean, for example, psychologists started to study the patterns of a conscious being, us, and like I say, sociologists start the patterns of society, so a more complex, let's say, group of interactions between conscious beings, people, let's say, and so this collaboration between sciences like neurobiology, psychology, biochemistry, physics, and mathematics created a very deep corpus of knowledge about consciousness itself. But we were still far from being able to ask questions about consciousness itself, because we were always talking about the brain, society, interaction between conscious beings. So we were talking about not about consciousness itself, but about the systems where consciousness arises. And one could say, well, but talking about consciousness itself is only a task for philosophy or for religion, because in reality, you cannot speak scientifically or rigorously about consciousness itself. You can only speak scientifically about the effects of consciousness in a system, in us, for example, no? Or in our brain, or how our brain triggers some conscious emotions or patterns or processes. You can try even to simulate a conscious system, like, for example, with a cellular automata. Modernly, we try to do that, to try to simulate thinking processes in a computer, for example. But we are still far from being able to ask questions about consciousness itself. And like I say, there are scientists that say you cannot ask questions about consciousness itself. You can ask questions about physical systems, about the brain, but not about consciousness itself. And there is exactly the starting point of my theory, because I would like uh, to propose that the change that we have to do is exactly a change of language, where we will be able to ask questions about consciousness itself. Um, And I will put an example soon, immediately, in a case where we were able to ask questions about something that is kind of tenuous, kind of very far from the reality, or something that is touchable, but we were able to have a theory that was able to talk about something like that, so abstract. And this theory is a branch of physics that was born at the end of the 19th century, that is called statistical mechanics. Statistical mechanics is a theory that in statistical mechanics, and most important in the 20th century, the continuation of statistical mechanics that is called information theory, talks about information in reality. Information is a very abstract concept. In principle, it looks like a very abstract concept, but in general, it is recognized that all our scientific theories, even the most advanced, they are talking about information. And so the birth of this statistical mechanics at the end of the 19th century, and of information theory in the statistics in the 20th century, marks an inflection point in our understanding of the topic of information itself, of how a system that processes information, how to describe a system that processes information. And one of the main characteristics of a conscious system, exactly, is that it's able to process information. Any system that we can call that is conscious there, that is consciousness there, is able to process information. And so to have a theory that is able to describe information itself will be a very interesting step in the direction of talking about one of the main properties of a conscious system that is able to process information. So the interesting thing that I want to notice is that information theory, especially information theory, is a theory that is speaking not only about the system that processes information, but about information itself. It's a system that is so ambitious that it tries to describe the properties of information itself. It speaks about the very object it is studying. It's a very abstract object, because information is kind of intangible. But this theory is able to speak about properties of this very intangible object of study. I would like to propose exactly the same thing, the same path of attack for consciousness, for the topic of consciousness. In my opinion, what we have to do is to change the language we speak about consciousness in such a way that we will be able to do the same trick that information theory does for information. That we will be able to speak about consciousness itself, not only about the effects of consciousness in a society or in a brain, or how a brain triggers conscious reactions or emotions or processes, but about the very object of our study, that is consciousness. And as we will see, I mean, the important conclusion, for example, of the books of Roger Penrose is that the theories we can talk about consciousness, like, for example, quantum mechanics, chaotic system, chaos theory, they are limited to be able to speak about. They have limitations to be able to speak about consciousness, and I will explain later when we will talk about quantum mechanics that exactly the limitation is a very fundamental limitation in the theory, because it's the very philosophy of quantum mechanics is the limitation itself. Let's go to the beginning of the 20th century, when we had the birth of quantum mechanics. And the birth of quantum mechanics is a complete departure. I mean, it's a very dramatic departure in the way that physics and science in general understands the world and the physical systems. Why? Because quantum mechanics is a very subjective theory, and it's really dramatically subjective. It is kind of radically subjective. I will show you how. Because in the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, that is the most orthodox, let's say, interpretation, it's kind of the canonical interpretation of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics says that the theory is not speaking about the external world or an objective world. The theory is only giving a tool or a kind of very fine-tuned machine to be able to interpret or to make, let's say, statements about measurements. For example, in the most radical, let's say, way of looking at things in the Copenhagen interpretation, the theory says that a property of a system does not exist until I measure it. It's not that it doesn't say that it does not exist. It says that we cannot say nothing scientifically about this property until we measure it. And quantum mechanics is just a toolbox to try to interpret the result of measurements. So until, for example, if I have this in my hand, I make an observation of this. I only, let's say, recognize which is the state in which this object is in the moment that I do the measurement. And of course, according to the constraint of the system, you have a lot of possible states where the system can be. But when you make a punctual measurement, the system collapses to only one of them. And if you make many measurements, then you get several possible results. In fact, you can get all of them, all the possible states in which a system is, with a certain distribution of probability. This is what is quantum mechanics is about. And quantum mechanics go a little bit beyond, saying that it is not scientific. It is not a scientific question to ask questions about the objects themselves, about an object itself. You only can ask questions, scientific questions, about the results of measurements, but not about the object itself. And look exactly to the analogy that I was using with information theory and with the consciousness. I am saying that I want to talk about consciousness itself, about the object of my study. And this seems to be dramatically in contradiction to the philosophy of quantum mechanics, because quantum mechanics says you cannot speak about the object itself, you can only speak about the result of measurements on this object, let's say. And so exactly the kind of blockade that Penrose was meeting when he was trying to apply quantum mechanics to study of consciousness is exactly the blockade that I recognize that we have to go a little bit beyond. You need, if you try to use quantum mechanics to attack the topic of consciousness itself, the very philosophy, the very philosophical basis of quantum mechanics, that is, you don't talk about objective things, you just talk about measurements, is what blockades you to go beyond. That's why, for example, Penrose has to use physical systems like the theory of microtubules in the neurons that he was trying to use to describe properties of the of consciousness. Like, for example, he was saying that only when near a microtubulus you have a concentration of mass similar to the Planck mass, you will get a quantum signal in the microtubulus, classical. I mean, it becomes classical and then chaotic and then exactly behaving like it has, for example, free will or something like that. No, so that's the kind of reasoning that Penrose had to do to try to go beyond the philosophical basis of quantum mechanics. He said that when we will combine with gravity, we will get kind of explanations, physical explanations on why, for example, a certain neuron, for example, triggers a certain chaotic pattern that later becomes a collective patterns of neurons. That is our experience of consciousness. And very interesting idea, but controversial. My way of going beyond quantum mechanics, I will use quantum mechanics as the basis, let's say, of to go further, will be a little bit more mathematical. Not so much physical. I am not going to try to go in the direction of quantum gravity or adding gravity to that. It will be something, a change in the way we treat the mathematical basis of quantum mechanics. It will be a very natural change in the language. You will see. I will try to motivate that as a natural change, and I hope it will be something interesting for you. So I want to make one further, let's say, to show you once again how deeply subjective is quantum mechanics, and how apparently well suited it is to speak about the topic of consciousness. That's why Penrose and a lot of people had a lot of faith that speaking about quantum mechanics, you will be able to speak about consciousness in a very good way. I mean, the language it seems to be ideal. And why? Well, in addition, that is subjective. When you start studying quantum mechanics, the first system that you are going to solve, the Schrödinger equation, you solve the free particle. So a particle that is not perturbed in any way, there is nothing acting on this particle. The best way of generating a model for a particle that is not perturbed is a localized in momentum particle, so very localized in momentum packet. And then when you solve the Schrödinger equation using this localization of momentum, that it means that is not perturbed, that is free, you get a solution in space, and your professor will ask you, don't you notice something interesting? Don't you see something interesting in this solution? Look at the width of the wave packet. And the wave packet, it increases linearly with time. The width of a wave packet, the Gaussian that you are going to get. So this particle is spreading linearly with time, even when nothing is acting on it. And your professor will tell you, what does it mean that? I mean, nothing is acting on this particle and it's somehow spreading. And your professor will tell you, because quantum mechanics is not speaking about the particle itself. It is speaking about your knowledge of this particle. When, according to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, if you have more or less localized the momentum of the particle, then you don't have well localized the position. And it's exactly what you are seeing there. And so it is speaking about how much you can get to know about this particle. It is about you. It is about the knowledge that a conscious system, in this case, but also an apparatus of measurement apparatus can get of this particle. So that the interesting point of quantum mechanics is a very subjective theory, and is so subjective that in reality the only thing that it is speaking about is about information. Information processed by a measurement apparatus, or one measurement apparatus that is our brain, ourselves, that is a very special measurement apparatus that has a very interesting property that is called consciousness. So even in principle, when quantum mechanics seems so well suited to speak about information, that is one of the main properties of a conscious system, even in this case, we find that quantum mechanics is limited. And the limitation is exactly what I told you, the very philosophical foundation of quantum mechanics. Why? Because, and this is my starting point of my theory, is that in reality, the properties of consciousness are not the effects of consciousness, but some properties that we know about consciousness, like, for example, robustness is robust. Our consciousness is robust. It doesn't change from time to time. I mean, it's kind of robust. I mean, I follow my consciousness everywhere. If consciousness follows me, my brain, my body, kind of localized. There is another property that we have learned recently, that is holographic, and we will speak about this property very much. I mean, because it's a very important property of conscious systems. There is the property of free will that it is very hard to explain in physical terms, but those are properties of consciousness itself. And those are not properties in general of systems where consciousness arises. So this is the starting point of my theory, and this is what I want to, the direction I want to go to. I would like to go to a theory similar to information theory, where we could finally speak about the very object of our study, not about only the systems where this object arises, but about consciousness itself, about the properties of consciousness. And to go there, we cannot use only quantum mechanics. The reason is what I gave you, and the reason is the same one that Penrose found in his books, that these limitations of quantum mechanics and the very nature, the very philosophical basis of quantum mechanics cannot allow us to make progress in the topic of consciousness itself. So I will leave this video here, and I hope you like it, and you come for the next one. Thank you.